Welcome to the Reddit realm. Today, we're diving into some of the most intense moments in law enforcement history. Police officers of Reddit were asked, "Have you ever had an all units call?" And their answers will leave you speechless. From high-speed chases to life or death situations, these stories give us a rare look inside the world of first responders. So buckle up and let's get into it. Story 1, former military police here. Air Force Security Forces. To be specific, I was patrolling base housing doing some LE training. I had been on station less than a year, and we heard a gunshot. We called it in immediately and started heading in the direction we heard it from. Those houses were duplexes, and the neighbors called it in as well. BDOC, dispatch, sent us, another police unit, and then the entire external response force. This was on a nuke base, so even things that don't actually have any impact on the nuclear mission totally have an impact on the nuclear mission. We had 19 total people on scene within about 3 minutes. As the first ones on scene, my post leader and I were already at the door when the rest of them showed up. I was thankful for them showing up when they did, because we were about to breach the door and go in just the two of us. We were told to hold for 30 seconds while the RF team got set up. Now we had a full stack and breaching equipment. I made a fist and thumped my helmet, signaling the breacher, who came up with his Halligan tool. My leader was number 2 in the stack, so she had to throw the flashbang. One of the RF guys passed it up from somewhere in the back of the stack, and as soon as the breacher had the door open, she tossed it in. All it did was scare the shit out of the dog. Only the husband was home, as his wife was deployed. He was sitting in the dining room on a chair with an SKS in his lap. I was maybe a pound or so of pressure away from pulling the trigger on my rifle when I realized that this dude's head was not fully intact. The SKS was only in his lap because the sling got caught on his arm after he pulled the trigger. As we cleared out the rest of the house, per procedure, I had my non-firing hand basically stuffed in my mouth to stop myself from puking. The dude's wife had sent him pictures and video of her cheating on him multiple times and telling him she wanted a divorce. He thought there was no other way out, so he shot himself. The only good news from that day is that we actually had picture and video evidence to use to charge her with adultery. OSI, like an Air Force version of the FBI, pulled her out of her deployment and got her back on station, and we charged her with everything we could, including Articles 92, 107, 125, which covers sodomy, and 134. She was stripped of all rank, forfeited all pay, went to confinement, and was dishonorably discharged after her 11 years of service. Story 2, former cop here. The all-units call was basically a riot at a large nightclub in a very rough area of the neighboring city. Once things were finally calmed down and the dozen or so people were taken away and my boss wanted us all back in our city, I was amazed at not only how many cops showed up, but from where, counties and towns I had never heard of before. I looked up a few at the end of shift, and some came from an hour plus away. Story 3, 25 years ago, smallish rural town. My dad is a beat cop on patrol. My cat brings in a live mouse and is playing with it in the kitchen, and my mom is deathly afraid of rodents. So she calls dispatch and tells them my dad needs to come home. Dispatch gets on the line and tells my dad to switch to a secured line. There's an emergency at home. My dad's driving home to take care of the issue when all of the cops of my small town on patrol come with sirens and lights blazing on my house because all they heard was there was an emergency at my dad's house. My mother was mortified. Story 4 was a military police officer on a rather large base. I was getting off shift and being transported back to my barracks by the guys coming on shift so I could check in my weapon. Suddenly, we got a call for all units to respond to a section of base housing. A military wife was having an affair with another soldier while her husband was on deployment. Supposedly, the husband was due to return soon, so she tried to break it off with the other guy. He responded by stabbing her several times. My team leader and I searched the tree line with our weapons drawn, because he's armed and it's dark outside, you know. I actually passed the guy with my team leader a few yards behind me, and suddenly he comes out saying, "You're looking for me." Scared the shit out of me. My team leader covered him while I went in for the handcuffing, making sure that I had my knee firmly planted in between his shoulder blades and thoroughly covering his upper torso into the muddy terrain. Not sure what happened after that. He was taken to a holding cell by another squad, and I got to go home. Ended up getting transferred from that base a few months later, but I know the wife survived the wounds. Story 5 happens all the time. Officers in a fight. Possible subject with a gun, major traffic accident. It's not anything like the movies. If it's a big enough incident, all your available units are going to be going Story 6. I work as a police communicator at a local university, usually an all units. Call is a fire alarm at one of the buildings. However, most of the time it's a false alarm and someone just burnt the popcorn at the lounge. Story 7, I got run over by someone fleeing the scene of an incident that they weren't involved in. He just got scared and apparently had a gun on him. I was out of my car talking to the person who called, and my partner was trying to stop the person who was really called on, so he didn't even see me get hit. No one knew I got hit or where I was because my radio went flying. Luckily, there was a lot of witnesses who called 911 and found my radio. I confused the dispatcher because I was in so much shock that I came over radio taking like I normally do, but I was bleeding badly from my head and broke my leg. I didn't feel the pain for about 2 hours. So I had that call come out because of me. I'm also pretty sure a policy got made because of me too. Story 8. Not an officer, but I'll share one of my buddies. He was an older gent who has passed on now, but if Reddit had been a thing when he was younger, this would have been a top Tifu. When he was still new, he worked in a larger city. They had just gotten these shoulder mics. You know, the ones every cop has now mounted up by their mouth so they can call in easier. When new to them, they wore the cord in front of their shirts, always in the damn way, and great handles when people wanted to wrestle. Jimmy was called one night to a bar brawl. He strolled into the bedlam almost over. He was a rookie, always getting the shit detail, so he was becoming famous among his department for ruining his uniforms. To the point, he was having to come out of pocket to replace them. He walked into a vet telling him to cuff everyone still here. They'll sort them out later. Jimmy grabs the closest guy, they struggle a little and go down to the ground. As they do, reep, Jimmy splits his pants. Clean up the backside. Knowing he's going to be the butt of jokes anyway, he turns his head to announce to the other officers, well, that's another uniform down. And keys his mic. Base hears uniform down. So does everyone else in the county. The radio explodes with chatter, but the 3 cops at the bar already have their hands full, so they turn down their radios. Base decided to roll everything with lights to the scene. Jimmy said they were glad of the help when the first few cars rolled up, but they just kept coming. He was known as Jack the Radio Ripper till he transferred. Minor reprimand, and he still had to pay for the pants. Story 9. Former Royal Canadian Mounted Police here in a small tourist town was working on a regular midweek day shift when we received a dispatched call for a bomb threat in the industrial commercial sector of the town. We all went there, called in the bomb squad, the dogs, got people out of the area, and so on. We were doing roadside when we got another call that the local bank's silent alarm was turned on. Now, we are in Canada. In a tourist town, things are usually relatively calm. But this was absolutely chaotic. We got the all-unit call. They call our neighboring detachment to help. We all split and head to the bank. We arrive, around 20-some patrol cars all around, there to see all bank employees bounded and gagged, smoke everywhere from smoke bombs. We realized very quickly that the bomb threat was the diversion. We immediately got a bolo out to get the 3 males, identified by the bank staff, including a former bank employee. We get the bolo out to CPIC, got words to airports and border crossings. We managed to catch 2/3 of the guys. The last one flew back to his home country, was in Canada on a student visa. We remained on high alert for days after this, looking for the 3rd guy. Canadian authorities worked with their colleagues from the other guy's country to get him extradited almost a year later. In the end, as I recall, about $130,000 were missing and never recovered. For most of us, it was the first time we had a bomb threat and/or a robbery. First time we were guarding an area, expecting to be shot at from an unknown location. The robbers were reported to have AK-47 type-looking weapons. Story 10. Not a police officer, but used to work corrections. An inmate decided to try and fight one of our newer guards. The inmate failed to realize he was a military policeman trained in hand-to-hand combat and just a good fighter. Lowell, we watched it on the cameras quite a few times after. Story 11 years ago, a friend of mine was a dispatcher for the county. He covered sheriff, EMS, and fire communications, and also worked with communicating with other agencies as well. From the state troopers, he got some sort of text communication, not a phone text, this was before that was a thing, and it referred to an accident with injuries at the intersection of I-40 and Business 85. Something along the lines of collision I-40, bus 85 injuries involved. The way it was abbreviated and written made him misread it. Instead of an accident at 85 Business, he thought there was a bus collision on Interstate 40 with 85 people injured. He dispatched every damn fire truck and ambulance the county had. They show up, and it's a two-car wreck with minor injuries. Story 12. So, I interned at the local PD at a time when all stations received new radio devices. The new devices looked a bit like old cell phones and had a bright orange panic button on top. It was meant for situations where, e.g., a single police officer was attacked and needed help. Pushing that button resulted in all communication on the standard Channel 1 being turned to one-way communication only, so all units would listen to what's going on wherever the panic button was pressed, and an automatic all-free units call. All other units had to switch to the much weaker Channel 2 to communicate, but Channel 2 only allowed one device to speak. So either dispatch OR Car 1, OR Car 2, etc. could talk, but not multiple people at the same time like on Channel 1. To disable the panic mode, you had to push the bright orange button in a certain way. Think of holding it for 3 seconds followed by 4 quick pushes. It could not be done remotely. This happened in a rather large city where some police stations are closed at night, usually the ones in the suburbs where few calls come in. That night, an older PO closed down the remotest station in the suburbs and decided to shut off the radio devices. You guessed it, he pushed the panic button on top because he thought that's where the devices were to be turned on and off, without realizing what he did. He locked the station and went home. Since it was the first day of using the new radio devices, quite a few officers were unsure how to turn to Channel 2. Basically, all communication was blocked. Cue panic everywhere with frantic cell phone calls to dispatch, and dispatch trying to figure out who closed that station, and thus had one of the only keys to open it, so the panic mode could be disabled. This unintentional all units call turned into an actual no units, con call, though quite a few units were busy trying to resolve the situation. Story 13. Buddy's first day on the phone at a fire station in an international airport. Airliner detects a fire in the rear by the generator. They are coming in hot and need assistance immediately. Buddy decides a major airliner incident is imminent. Calls the city fire department, which might have 80 fire stations. They all send every unit, expecting complete mayhem. Airplane lands safely. False alarm. 200 fire trucks are lined up for miles outside the airport. No one was able to get in because the gate was closed. My rookie friend botched his all-units call. Story 14. All-unit calls are more common and less critical than movies would have you believe. What you may be referring to instead is a code swordfish. A memorable one a few years back was during a celebrity night. They were doing this charity event with a couple of famous personalities, amongst which was Helen Mirren. At around 2 a.m., a code swordfish is sent out, and everyone rushes to the event. The scene was a coke-fueled bedlam of apocalyptic proportions. People screeching and tearing at each other's faces, a man biting into a live cat, a pool filled with foam, chlorine, and offal. And in the middle of all this was Dame Helen Mirren. She was riding bareback on a fat, hairy man, slapping her thighs in excitement and screaming her head off. I never saw so much vigor and ecstasy in a single person. She was making this weird facial thing like a horse blowing raspberries and throwing loud wet farts after each one. We tased her, but she ran butt naked into the street, climbed a palm tree, and swung away from tree to tree. We caught her a day later when the coke wore off, and she crept into a local chicken farm to sleep. Story 15. Happened to my dad. When he was stationed overseas, there was an air show disaster in Germany, and he was already there, so he was one of the first to respond. He struggles from it still. Fireworks and barbecues remind him of the smell of burning flesh that day. Story 16. Usually about once a month or so. We're taught that if you need backup, if shit's hitting the fan, call it in and worry about how many people come later. A unit was on patrol 2 weeks ago, and some guy just started shooting at him. All the unit got out was 34th Street, 1033, I'm taking fire. 1033 being the code for send the cavalry officer in need of assistance. It all ended fine. We caught the guy, no injuries. But you better believe every officer in our area dropped what they were doing and went. Another recent one, a mini riot broke out at a candle vigil for a murder victim. An officer stepped in alone, bad move, to stop the fight and started getting his ass handed to him. All he said was, "Potomac, 1033." But it worked. We came in, dispersed the crowd, and got out. Edit. Good chance to rant about a pet peeve of mine. When a 1033 goes out, there are always a few units who block the air with useless chatter. Hold me responding. What's their location? Dispatcher, I'll come back to my current assignment later. Do they need a rifle on scene? It drives me crazy. Get off the radio and leave the air clear for the unit fighting for their lives. And every unit not on something absolutely necessary is required to respond. Why would you waste time to say you're going? No shit, you're going. Story 17. I remember listening to an episode of This American Life where an officer accidentally locked himself in the back of his car when he went to take a nap. He left his radio in the front, so he called dispatch and was like, "Don't make this a big thing, just send one unit to me." And then dispatch proceeded to call out the code for officer down. So then he heard a bunch of cars put on their sirens and raced to him. Story 18. My dad was a PAPD officer for 30 years. 2 times he had all units calls. First was the 1993 WTC bombing. The second was September 11, 2001. If he didn't pass away from an illness related to his time at the WTC site in 2001, he'd be able to convey his impressions of that day better than I could. I recently found his handwritten notes from that night. They were jumbled together on his notepad and placemats from a diner in the area. Story 19. Not a cop, but former practicing journalist, current PR person. Got a text about a shooting. Turned out a cop made a stop, got shot in the neck by the passenger, killed the passenger, and shot the driver. Driver got away. Cops from the 2 adjoining cities came. Sheriff's deputies, airport police, and university police all came out in under 3 minutes. About 150 cops. Within 30 minutes, marshals, FBI, and ATF were there as well. Largest response I've ever seen. There were rounds that had been fired into the buildings surrounding the area. It was a mess. I was in the wrong place at the right time, I guess. Last story I ever did. Made the full-time switch to PR. The cop survived. Story 20. I was doing a ride-along in college in a fairly small city in Georgia when we got an all-available units call. The address came in, the lights and siren went on, and we were hauling ass at about 120 across town. I had no idea where we were headed until we got there. The only thing the officer said to me was, "No matter what happens, stay in the fucking car. If you see anyone with a gun, call it out on the radio like this." Showed me. "If any of us get shot, call it in and stay in the car." Then he took a deep breath, calmly got out of the car, and took off at a sprint towards a 40-person melee in front of the only strip club in town. We were the first car there. Over the course of the next 30 seconds, officers arrived and kept coming until they outnumbered the people fighting. The officer I was riding with was completely on his own for a 10-second eternity and was able to rip about 10 people apart from fighting before backup arrived. It was the single bravest and most humbling thing I've ever seen with my own eyes. When it was all over, he got back in the car with 3 drunk and beaten-up dudes in the back, turned to me and said, "So, when you gonna sign up?" I've got a couple more stories from that summer doing ride-alongs if anyone wants to hear. Story 21 might not have been an all-units call, but the day my daughter went unresponsive after having a febrile seizure, the 911 dispatcher sent out unresponsive 2-year-old, and we had about 30 EMT, police, firefighters, at our house in minutes. We live in a rural area, short distance from fire hall, ambulance hall, and everyone is a member EMT. Thankfully, she was okay, but it was scary for us at the moment when her temperature wouldn't go down and then she passed out. Story 23. My father was a highway federal officer, Federal de Caminos, rough translation, here in Mexico. They were armed with light machine guns of standard caliber because shit goes real against the cartels here in the northern border. But it's so big and spaced out, you have to deal with it yourself because the nearest unit can be 1+ hour away and they have reinforced trucks. Anyway, he once told me that he encountered a convoy of 3 Humvees while he was on the side of the road relatively hidden. He opened fire at the first Humvee's tires and it loses control. The other 2 break and like 12 dudes with Kalashnikovs come out to fire in random directions. They probably didn't saw where they got shot from. And my father lays down suppressing fire on them until 2 units come from each side of the road from a relatively nearby station to arrest what's left of them. Story 24. A friend of mine was a K-9 cop with a local small police department. He was a solid guy, but by his own admission, wasn't the brightest. As an example, he couldn't learn the German commands for the dog, so they had to teach the dog English. Anyway, one day an all-call or whatever it's called came in. It was regarding a shooting, which is rare here. My friend was taking a dump at the time, and his dog was in his SUV K-9 Mobile. The cops went running out and jumped in whatever car was available. The K-9 was in the back seat. When some other cop jumped in the SUV, the K-9 got spooked and clamped down on the cop's neck. He freaked out and started screaming into his radio. All the other cops thought he'd arrived at the scene and been shot. My friend, hearing on the radio and knowing how his dog acts, ran out of the bathroom pulling his pants up. Havoc ensued. If I were a cop, I'd want to work for a small police department. Story 25. Obligatory, not a cop. But I once got an all-unit call to my house. Backstory, my mom was dating a meth head and everyone knew who he was. And our address. I was around 15, and one night, he went off the rails and was beating the shit out of my mom. I got involved just in time to see him swing at my sister, who was 7 at the time. I ran for the phone and called it in. I got as far as the address when he grabbed me by the neck and threw me. Well, the dispatcher heard my garbled yelp and called it in as a possible homicide in progress. That, combined with his reputation, sent every single cop in the surrounding jurisdictions came flying our way. By the end of it, I think there was 20-plus police officers at our house. I ended up hitting him with my mom's cast iron skillet to keep him there just as the first officer showed up. He was super cool about it and pretended he didn't see a thing. It was a terrible night, and my mom was mad at me for months. But man, you don't fuck with my little sister. Story 26. I served in West Belfast, Northern Ireland. Due to the high threat level in my division, we would patrol in 2 X-armored Land Rovers, each with minimum 3 armed officers, one of which would have an assault rifle, or SMG. Basically, we could handle most scenarios. One day, however, our vehicle was in an intentional head-on collision with a stolen car, as it was driving towards local children playing in the street. This resulted in our front wheel arch bending to the point the vehicle could travel no more. In a few minutes, the community we were there to protect turned against us. It was like Black Hawk Down. A few hundred people came out of the woodwork when they realized we were an easy target. Petrol bombs and bricks rained on top of us as we attempted to pursue the car thief on foot. We jumped in the back of our vehicle and called for assistance. In under 5 minutes, a fleet of approximately 5 to 6 armored Land Rovers appeared from the neighboring division and drove the crowd back. They managed to tow us to safety, and we lived to get bricked another day. Story 27. As the story goes in Duluth, Minnesota, for a long time the radio signal that available officers could meet for Dunkin' Donuts was the code word Broken Arrow. One day, a non-Duluthian was in the local newsroom when this was overheard. He got alarmed and told the rest of the newsroom that the code word likely meant that the police station was at that moment overwhelmed and outgunned, and they were calling all available units to help. Reporters rushed to the scene to find donuts. That code word is no longer used. Story 28. Not a police officer. But I had an incident where 20 police cars were in my neighborhood the day my mom passed away. They wouldn't let us see her until after the autopsy came back, and she had a heart attack. My entire house was filled, and it was a decent-sized house. One was sitting in my gaming chair looking through things, like, dude, you're not going to find anything on a 14-year-old girl's desk. It was around 9 a.m. when I found her, and by the time they all left, it was close to 11 p.m. Story 29. Remember a few years ago, those bank robbers in full-body armor who just walked around shooting up cops and turning their cars into Swiss cheese? Cop says to dispatch, officer down, then another, officer down, then another, and dispatch says, we got that. But cop says multiple officers down. It was chilling. I'm sure a Reddit sleuth could find it. Story 30. My uncle told me a story once about getting called on a code swordfish, which is a bit more serious than just all units. There was this coked-up 6-foot-something huge guy who had just shot up a liquor store and was tearing down the interstate. He told us there were probably about 15 cop cars already tailing him when he caught up, with 2 state troopers leading. When he got onto the interstate, he was practically right next to the guy. They ran his car off the road, and the dude jumps out while it's still moving and runs across the interstate. He jumps over the guardrail and falls about 10 feet to the other side of the interstate, runs across that into the woods. The two state troopers got out as soon as they saw him running and took off after him with my uncle not far behind. One of them didn't realize how far the fall was and broke his ankle. The other chased down the guy. By the time my uncle got there, the other state trooper was staggered and about to pass out from how hard his ass got kicked. My uncle, without breaking his sprint, charged the guy and threw the heaviest haymaker he could. The guy went out immediately. Later, they had to go to the hospital to file reports since they had to take the guy in for the drug stuff. My uncle was sitting on a chair with his hat over his hand in his lap. The doctor comes in and asks him how big of a flashlight did he hit the dude with. My uncle just lifts his hat and shows his bruised and swollen hand. Apparently, he hit the guy so hard it fractured his temple and very nearly killed him. And that wraps up today's stories. Some of these moments were intense, others were downright terrifying, but they all show just how unpredictable life can be for those in law enforcement. What did you think about these all-units calls? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching the Reddit Realm, and I'll see you in the next one.